All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second session on our webinar, Debating Lineages of Socialism in Africa. And this session is called Socialist Futures. It's part of a series of webinars on the occasion of the centenary of the South African Communist Party. And because I'm a presenter in this session and I was chairing this morning's session, I've asked my colleague, who is Prof. Christy van der Westhuizen, who is going to chair the first part of this session. And I think I'll hand over to Christy. Thank you so much, Christy, for being here.
Right, thank you so much, Janet, and good afternoon to everybody. Very good to be with you today. I was able to connect in earlier and hear some of the conversations so far, and some very rich inputs this morning already. And I'm sure our afternoon session will be similarly engaging and with lots of food for thought. So yeah, welcoming all of you. As Janet mentioned, my name is Christy van der Westhuizen. I'm an associate professor at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy here at Nelson Mandela University. And without further ado, let me introduce our speakers for this afternoon. And I'll also just give you a bit of a sense. We will basically be listening to Devan Pillay and Sidney Luckett during the first hour. And then later on this afternoon, we'll be hearing from Janet Cherry and Mazibuko Jara. So let's move immediately over to Devin. Devan Pillay is with the University of the Witwatersrand. He will be speaking to us on the topic in search of a democratic eco-socialist working class politics. Devin is a former political prisoner. He has obtained his doctorate under the supervision of Harold Walpy. He has had a very rich history working with socialist questions, working in politics, working in labor, including as a writer for the South African Labour Bulletin. He was editor of Work in Progress, director of the Social Policy Program at UDW. Head of research at NUM, and also director of policy at GCIS. Currently, he's with the sociology department at Wits University. So Devin, let me hand over to you, and you've got 20 to 25 minutes to speak with us today.
Thanks, Christy. I presume you can all see the slides?
Yes, we can see, yes.
Okay, so I've titled this talk, an eco-socialist working class politics, with a question mark, and it'll become apparent later on why there's a question mark. Of course, socialism nowadays has a big question mark for a range of reasons. So following on what we discussed this morning, and in a sense, to some extent, there's a departure point from what Jeremy Cronin had to say. So what I'm saying here is not particularly controversial. It would have been controversial perhaps a few years ago. But questioning the Marxist-Leninist trajectory of the 20th century and the dead ends of Marxist-Leninism, which of course was embraced not only by the communist parties allied to the Soviet Union throughout the world, but also by Trotskyist groups and others. Now, one, I'm critical of the historical role of the SACP. I'm also appreciative of its positive role in promoting a non-racial class politics. However, we need to be reminded of what Joe Slovo himself, the former General Secretary of the Communist Party, had a critique of the vanguardist nature of Marxist-Leninism. And by vanguardist, as opposed to a vanguard, the Kerala Communist Party is still a vanguard party, but practices bottom-up participatory democracy. Vanguardist, as Slovo characterized it, is where democratic centralism is more centralist than democratic. Very top-down, hierarchical, and male. Productivist, not questioning the GDP growth paradigm per se, except its lack of redistribution, effective redistribution under capitalism, and not acknowledging what some environmental Marxists like O'Connor calls the second contradiction of capitalism, capital versus nature, where capital is undermining the very conditions for its existence by destroying nature in a variety of ways. Patriarchal, the communist parties throughout the world, and the South African Communist Party is no exception to that, is very patriarchal in many ways, but in particular, and it's also at the programmatic and conceptual level, not just that gender issues were marginalized, but as eco-feminists emphasized, the reproduction of labor power was completely ignored, even by Marx himself. Which is what some people call body politics, and that has major implications for a socialist strategy. And the party also abandoned space to build alternative perspectives in an alliance with other progressive forces in communities, etc. Now, we mentioned in the previous session something that Jeremy acknowledged, that the party is not rooted in communities. And of course, a lot of this, as he himself acknowledged, is related to the party being focused on state power and patronage politics, and leaders at various levels looking to the ANC to move up the social ladder. But there were attempts in the party, as we mentioned previously in that session, to build alternatives with communities, food gardens in Soweto, etc. The Gauteng Communist Party led this, but this was completely ignored by the party hierarchy because it was so focused on state power and building alternatives within communities in alliance with a range of progressive forces. These were often NGOized, as the previous speaker in the earlier session talked about, NGOized and cast aside because they didn't follow the National Democratic Revolution script. And so the party lost or ignored an opportunity to build something different, to build socialism today within the interstices of capitalism. So that is the critique. Now, I draw inspiration by someone who was not a member of the Communist Party, but who was nonetheless a Marxist, Rick Turner, who many of you may know. And he had a chapter in his book, The Eye of the Needle, called titled The Necessity of Utopian Thinking. Now, Rick Turner was an intellectual inspiration for the workers' movement in the 1970s. And in fact, COSATU does pay homage to him, and they have a room named after him at COSATU House. And he had a humanist approach, a humanist Marxist approach. Some of my friends in the syndicalist, anarchist movement want to claim him as a syndicalist, but I think he very explicitly called himself a Marxist. And he offered a very radical critique of apartheid capitalism in the 1970s, where he addressed the social, political, and environmental impacts of apartheid capitalism, something that was not really emphasized in public discourse at that time. But in that book, The Eye of the Needle, you see its explicit references to the environmental degradation caused by apartheid capitalism, which, you know, as I said, was not, was only, that sort of critique was confined to very few environmental groups. In particular, he emphasized participatory democracy in all spheres of life, what he called workers' control. And he was very explicit about this. It was a very radical critique in the 1970s, published through Sprocas, which was a church funded publishing initiative. And he challenged the vanguardist politics, which was operational at the time. And as I said, he was a major inspiration to the newly forming trade unions in the 1970s that became part of FOSATU, the Federation of South African Trade Unions, but also the independent unions, the General Workers Union, the Western Cape, and the Food and Canning Workers Union, all of whom eventually became part of COSATU, along with the UDF unions that were adopting a more traditional SACP, ANC approach. Now Turner's perspective can be related to what the late Eric Olin Wright, well, Rick Turner is also late because he was assassinated in the late 70s. Eric Olin Wright had this project called Real Utopias, and he's got books published on this. And it's about having a utopian vision, so the necessity of utopian thinking, having a utopian vision without a utopian vision that takes us out of narrow possibilism that especially the union movement and others say, well, there's no alternative. We've got to work within very, very narrow parameters on the one hand, but it's real in the sense that it's not a dreamy utopianism. On the other hand, it does not relate to the complexities of power politics. So having a long-term emancipatory vision, but short to medium-term tactical flexibility. And that informed the activities and the outlook, the practical outlook, the practice of the labor movement within the FOSATU so-called workerist tradition. And to great extent, with great success. Now, eco-socialism is it's a relatively new concept. Some of you may be very familiar with it, others might not be. It's not a term that is embraced by the SACP particularly, although I've seen, I think Janet was the first person to write an article in African Communist on eco-socialism, if I'm correct. The first and only person. Although to be fair, I have been invited to write something, but I haven't got around to it yet. So the party at least is now a bit more open to these new ideas, which would have been impossible not so long ago. So what is eco-socialism? Well, there's a variety of emphases. On the one hand, you have the degrowth perspective, which is very prominent within Europe, Western Europe, and perhaps North America. A strong critique of industrial growth and coming to the conclusion that developed countries need to stop growing, basically redistribute the social surplus that they already have. Although in this perspective, they didn't modify their position and say, well, degrowth cannot be applied to the developing world. We've got to allow for green growth. And the Green New Deal embraces both dimensions of thinking. So it's a relatively new perspective. There are various versions of a Green New Deal. There's a more mainstream or incorporated version, and a more radical version that's close to an eco-socialist perspective. The other thing that is noted by this broad school of thought is that it is not just one movement, but it's a movement of movements. And often they talk of red, green, and purple alliances, red meaning the social dimension of various kinds, social or socialist, green, the environmental, and purple, gender and sexuality issues. Now, there are three perspectives within this that I want to highlight because it's relevant to what Luckett will talk later in the Rojavite example, and the intellectual inspiration, Abdullah Öcalan. He will expand on that. And he draws inspiration from the social ecology, which is an anarchist perspective, Marx and Engels, because he was a Marxist Leninist, and ecofeminism. And that is what those are the intellectual inspirations behind the revolution in Rojava that is currently being built. So the social ecology perspective emphasizes democratic decentralization, and given the peculiar situation of the Kurds being located in different countries, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, they are building a society without a state. It's actually very, very fascinating and exciting. And they draw inspiration from Murray Bookchin, a former Marxist who became an anarchist. The ecological Marxist perspective, which has been building up over the past 30 years, well, 25 years or so. Paul Burkett and John Bellamy Foster were the two main theorists who unearthed Marxist thinking about the metabolic rift between humans and nature and between town and country. And they believed that Marx had this perspective starting right from his PhD thesis, and it permeates all his work. Kohei Saito, who published a book recently He's gone a step further, and he's looked at Marx's ecological notebooks, which were unavailable before, and shows how towards the end of his life, Marx went really deep into the ecological question, which is quite exciting. I've got this is the book, you can see it. And the eco-feminist or Marxist feminist perspectives, there are varying degrees of difference, emphasizing different aspects within this school of thought. But the key point, and this is something that Silvia Federici, who wrote a path-breaking book, Kaliban and the Witch, looking at witch hunts in Europe in the 16th and 17th century, and how that was a major expression of the displacement of women from the center of public life, and laid the groundwork for capitalism to confine women to the private, so-called private sphere, and where women were involved with the social reproduction of labor power, unpaid labor, the externalization of the cost of reproducing the working class was left to women in the private sphere. That is the body politics, which was the blind spot of Marx. So Silvia Federici, a Marxist, she looks at Marx's notion of primitive accumulation and agrees with it, but says that's all about waged labor, and completely ignores the social reproduction of labor power. Ecofeminists argue increasingly, and there are a lot of groups, even in South Africa, the women in mining groups, for example, talk about how a broader focus that looks at both dimensions, wage labor as well as the reproduction, the production process and the reproduction of labor power, allows for a broader focus outside of the workplace, outside the narrow framing of the decent work for all, for example, which is what the labor movement is focused on, and looking at the decent life for all, which poses all these questions very differently, where the care economy is integrally part of a socialist outlook, food sovereignty, community controlled, renewable energy, etc. And what ecofeminists do is they tie in the subordination of women to the subordination of nature. The manner in which capitalism subordinates women is very similar to the manner in which it subordinates nature, as well as subordination of colonized people, as capitalism, of course, expanded, as we all know, and scientific racism grew alongside perspectives around around women not being truly human, and nature having to be dominated and subordinated. Now, the eco-socialist perspective, and particularly the happiness perspective, draw on ancient lineages, which I won't go into too deeply now, so in danger of running out of time. And looking at the socialistic impulses in the thinking of the axial age around between 800 and 200 BCE. And there's interesting work that's come out. And Öcalan himself has written about this. He has a 5,000-year historical perspective. And David Graeber as well. I think Sid will mention a bit more about that. David Graeber looks at debt, a 5,000-year perspective of debt, and also talks about the axial age. And it was a period of violent class formation and the disruption of what Marx called primitive communism. something that the Buddha himself encountered in northern India, as he developed his own compassionate responses to human suffering. And all of these have socialistic impulses and have synergies with more recent indigenous thought, like bien vivir in Latin America amongst indigenous communities that have come to the fore in the marriage between the urban labor movement and indigenous communities in Bolivia, for example, even though that's now being contested in different ways. Ubuntu, a radical understanding of Ubuntu, has these synergies, as well as with the happiness and well-being perspective. For example, like the gross national happiness of Bhutan. While not explicitly socialist, if we look more deeply, we'll see synergies. So the Buddhist principle of sufficiency, or the Native American living well, is counterposed to the capitalist treadmill of accumulation, living better than others. Now, in South Africa, we've had embryonic expressions of eco-socialism. There are a range of NGOs and social movements, and particularly women, like in the Woman network of organizations in mining, etc. You could say that Kaliban struggles in the Transkei have eco-socialist impulses. But the one that really captured the imagination was in NUMSA, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, during the period of 2011 to 2015, which I characterize as an embryonic eco-socialist moment. Embryonic, because it was the beginnings of that. And they came up with some very exciting proposals around socially owned renewable energy, which was actually officially adopted as a resolution by the Union in 2012. And it also had resonance within COSATU, who adopted a far-reaching environmental policy in 2013, all of which were sidelined by a leadership that didn't have the vision and the imagination to carry it forward. Instead, what NUMSA did was it marginalized those who were promoting this new vision in the Union and reasserted 20th century Marxist-Leninism, and it ended up with the formation of the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party in 2018, end of 2018. Sid was a member, so you can say more about that. And of course, you know what happened to them in the elections, where even their own members didn't vote for them, which was a tragedy. Nonetheless, I still believe this eco-socialist impulse is still there, but it just needs to be reignited.
Devin, not to interrupt you, but you've got about 2 minutes left.
Okay.
I'm afraid to say.
No, good. So, well, Sid will pick up on a lot of points. Caroline, I can come back to Carol, but we did mention some of that. Jeremy mentioned it in the previous session. Rojava is something that Sid will focus on, and he has a lovely little video clip about women's power there. And why a working class politics? Well, there's room for critique there. Why still holding on to the notion of working class, because it's so much tied to the male urban wage labor. But it's, in a sense, it's paying homage to Turner, but then saying you've got to move beyond that. And Marx talked about the oppressed versus the oppressor. He had a broad conception as well as a more focused one. And I'm thinking of Michael Leibowitz, who I met in Venezuela. And he's a Marxist scholar, and he emphasizes that broad understanding. Ralph Miliband talks about the dominated class versus the dominated, the dominant class. And David Graeber in the Occupy movement he popularized the notion of the 99% versus the 1%. And to conclude, so if a patriarchal class politics that ignores social reproduction and this second contradiction of capital versus nature is a fossilized class politics, then environmentalism without class politics is just gardening. That comes from an environmental activist. And to segue into Sid's talk, this is very, very inspiring, a living example of women's liberation, grassroots democracy, a cooperative economy, as well as a green emphasis in Rojava. And I'll hand over to Sid.
Thank you so much, Devin. And that's a fantastic quote that you left us with there at the end. I'm sure we will have a very lively conversation about this. Let me immediately introduce Sid Luckett, who will be speaking on Liberating Life, Reflections on Marxist Dialectics. So Sid is a social and environmental justice activist and researcher. He was a leader in the UDF in the 1980s and a member of the James Kalata cell of the ANC Western Cape MK structure. After 1990, he turned his focus to human and ecological systems, or human/ecological systems, in KZN mainly. And in more recent years, he's shifted his focus to the Kurdish Human Rights Action Group, which is based in Cape Town, as an expression of these concerns with environmental and social justice issues. And because of his passion for documentary photography, he finds himself regularly in Lebanon and in the Kurdish region of Turkey. So Sid, I'm going to hand over to you, and you've got 20 to 25 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Christy, and thanks, Devin. My ability in technology is not that great, but I hope I get this right. Are you seeing?
We're seeing something.
Yes.
Seeing something.
Yes, we are seeing something. In fact, your PowerPoint is making its way across the screen, so that's a good
Okay,
sign.
great. Okay, I'll have to. Okay, so I call it liberating life because that's a term that Öcalan uses.
That you need to make it full screen.
Yeah, I think you just need to move it a bit to the center, and full screen is probably a good idea. Yeah.
Press that green one.
The green sharing.
No, the green dot. That should make it full screen.
That top left-hand corner.
Top left-hand is a green dot.
Okay. If I press that, enter full screen. Okay, there we go. Okay, thanks. Liberating life is a term that Öcalan uses to describe this eco-feminist political praxis. It's not only him, it's been taken up by a wide range of people. But let me move on to this quite quickly through some of the beginning stuff. I have the same, Richard Turner had an impact on me when I was a student at Stellenbosch University. And so there was a kind of connection with Devin. Most of my work, I was ordained as a priest, and most of my work has been in church-based activism, firstly in Crossroads, squatter settlement, then the UDF MDM, and as you said, Christy, in the ANC. But my formation in that period of the 1980s was through South American liberation theology and basic ecclesial communities. In fact, I went on a trip through various countries in South America. I got disillusioned by the ANC and the SACP, but the Freedom Charter and people like Chris Hani remained an inspiration. In about 2013, I was approached by someone that many of people know is Judge Essa Musa, who attracted me to CRAG. He asked me to come and join CRAG because I wasn't being very politically active then. Well, I did that, and that got me into the whole issue. That's Kurdish Human Rights Action Group, got me into the whole Kurdish struggle. SRWP happened along the line. I was recruited into that and asked to be on the steering committee in the Western Cape. But I ran slap bang into this hardline Marxist Leninist thing that both Devin and earlier Jeremy has spoken about. And so when it came down to, and very state oriented, so they even contested the elections. At that point, I strongly resisted contesting elections. We needed to do a lot more work on the ground. And at that point, I left, or they left me. So became more and more involved in the Freedom for Öcalan, and in 2020 joined a long march through Europe called the Long March for the Freedom of Öcalan. So that's very basic, quickly my background. Now, why is this not moving on? Okay, so that's Abdullah Öcalan. That's the PKK. He was one of the founders of PKK. In fact, two male students and two female students founded it. Two of the female students were later assassinated, but that's Öcalan in Lebanon, with the PKK. The PKK, sorry, is the Kurdish Workers' Party, training camp in the Bekaa Valley, where he met with Palestinian refugees who actually helped him considerably. Okay, so I've got this about the, let me go back, sorry, there. Other students, 1974, he was abducted in Kenya on his way to South Africa in 1999. He was then from Lebanon, he'd gone into Syria, in the northern part of Syria, and he had to leave. His life was under threat from the Syrian regime at that point. He was imprisoned on Imrali Island, and he's been in solitary there since 1999, actually. He's written a number of books in prison. The latest, The Sociology of Freedom, has translated into more than 20 languages. He's a Mandela-like figure, and many regard his freedom as important for that region. Sorry, I'm getting some interference with my thing here. Let me just hold on a minute while okay. So for those who don't know, this is the Rojava in Syria. But as Devin said, it extends over to Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. And in fact, it was started in Turkey, the PKK. So this is the whole Kurdish region. They were promised a separate state, or they'd hoped for a separate state after the end of the First World War, but the Allied forces decided to divide up that Middle East differently. And they divided up the Middle East in much the same way as Africa was divided, and not taking account of any local communities or languages or cultures. And the big issue, can you see my arrow? That Kobani became headline news throughout the world at some point, because there the women were in the forefront of defending a group called the YPJ. It's a women's defense unit, were in the front line of defending Kobani, with very ill-equipped against a very massively equipped ISIS that had moved right across that region. Okay, it started off, as Devin said, as a Marxist-Leninist, and moved in its early 1990s to eco-socialism, a genealogy, and I'll come to that. There's a KCK, is the Kurdistan Communities Union. It's an umbrella organization for Kurdish parties right across Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Sakin Anzik and two other women leaders of the PKK assassinated in Paris. And the YPJ, as I said earlier, is the Women's Defense Units who attracted world attention on Kobani. So these are the kinds of pictures that you can see everywhere on the social media. And so that's Kobani in the background, that's picture, and this kind of thing. But that's kind of Hollywood style pictures. There's much more groundwork that was going on. And I don't know if you can see this now. Can you see that film at all?
Yes, we can see
Oh, you
it.
can? Okay,
Make it
great.
large.
Yes, I will. Thanks. I wasn't sure that I'd be able to, that you'd be able to see it. Great. I'm pleased about that. So let me go back to it and I'll make it large. Because this will just give you a sense of.
What does revolution mean? Is it about exchanging one power dynamic to another? Is it just a little statement or a long-term plan of action to say it's a practice? Is it about to fix the uncompromising examples of the past? Or is it about to build new definition of society? For the woman here in Northern Syria, also called Rojava, the revolution is an immense level. It is your first practical step to direct democracy, communal economy, and the society's emancipation to women's empowerment. It is the irreversible divergence towards the silent rules of capitalism. What Javaza is saying, you cannot abolish capitalism without abolishing the state, and you cannot abolish the state without abolishing patriarchy. Here, its consequences are present everywhere. The war, with all the terror, death, and misery it carries, can be felt in every corner. 3 million people are still living in the 3 cantons of Rojava. And while the bombs are still falling on neighboring cities, they organize themselves. They are planning daily life, as well as the implementation, step by step, of their long-term vision. Within it, the women are making sure that from its very foundation, their society is giving them equal opportunity and recognition. But double oppression means also double fight. To free themselves from the state and men's subordination, they are organizing both in command and in women-only committees. In every field like economy, culture, self-defense, and local communes, women have their own committees. All their work is organized to Congressa, the Confederation of Women's Movement, founded in 2005. They believe that women's autonomy is crucial to confront male-dominated institutions and build sustainable alternatives. Since 2012, women from all walks of life have openly taken part in every aspect of the society's growth and protection. They know that to take back their right to self-determination, they have no choice but to challenge the state monopoly of protection by creating their own defense forces. Here in Serikani, it's mothers that protect their own neighborhood.
أفكار القوة لكن القوة يعني أنا خبرت في نقابة في نصار بجانب كذا أم بديك أم فرسنا بزار فاتين أم في ملتيج بفارزن أم في ملتيج قديدة كذا يعني في غادي عربي كردي سرياني كيف ببرابة برضو يعني حالتك حربت المدارس مثلا شو وقتين أبا وقتين أشوا
What does it mean when we give weapons to the people? Being part of a HEPAJ, the society's protection forces, isn't only about being on the street with weapons. It's much more about redefining the real meaning of protection. What a society should protect. How? Why is the right to self-defense so important? To break away from the behavior of state authorities, the Javas and Khors are the first to be trained about ethics, history, local customs, and justice. They consider weapons just as the technical aspect of self-defense.
Okay, it's a great clip, and you can. I just now need to get back to where I was before. Okay, can you see that now? Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Right.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, you can. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so the whole woman, life and freedom is the central core. It's called Jin, the Kurdish words are Jin, Jian, Azadi. Jin and Ji, they have the same root, and that's woman and life, and then freedom, Azadi. Genealogy is the science or the understanding of women, which is central to the PKK. Here's just another picture. This is in Diyarbakir, where I visited. I've been there twice, 2014 and 2019. This person, these photos aren't mine, but this person is an MP for the HDP. It's the opposition party. There she is surrounded by police. They would not let her move into a community, and they made it quite clear. But she continues. She's actually a lawyer, and she'd served 5 years in prison. She was never tried for anything. She was just detained, as it were, for 5 years. But she continues. She's still a lawyer, still a member of parliament in that region. It's a complicated situation where Turkish regime recognizes the move. They allow members of parliament to move around, but as you can see, in a very restricted way. Okay. As I said earlier, the PKK started as a normal Marxist-Leninist liberation organization, just like Marxist-Leninist groups throughout the world. It was Soviet-backed, but they transformed into this eco-socialist, feminist, democratic confederalism. And Devin has spoken about eco-socialism and feminism. I won't want to say anything more about that. But I do want to say a little bit about democratic confederalism, because democratic confederalism, I think, would address some of the issues that have been raised already. It's a decision-making process which is not confused with the processes of public administration. States administer, democracies govern. What I saw in Rojava, and I was hosted by the KCK, was that's kind of a loose organization of many number of organizations, like an umbrella for many number of organizations, which we could liken it to the UDF, but it transcends boundaries. It goes across to Syria, it's in Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran to some extent. And they have what they call a school in which the individuals take shape, and the communes, and you work within communes. So what we've seen earlier are women that are in communes, but there's individual freedom to move between or be members of different communes. You're not tied to a particular commune. A commune is really a group of people who hold to that understanding of the Jin, Jian, Azadi. And women should only be, and these are some of the principles. Women should only belong to herself. It's a very male-dominated society. The Kurdish area is very tribal. It's got local chiefs. So one of their big fights was against this male domination. Economic autonomy. So you have local market economies that take account of, but they take account of the regional market. They recognize that in the regional market. It's a bit like the closest that we have, I suppose, in the Western Europe is something like Mondragon in the Basque region. We have local autonomies, local, not actually they aren't communes, but they're more like little business organizations. But the communes in Rojava, you have different kinds of communes. They have a legal structure which compromises with national constitution. So what they're aiming is no longer for a separate state. In that turn towards this eco-socialist, that shift away from that strict Marxist-Leninist state liberation, they then felt that it doesn't make sense to try and form another state. It would just get them into the same locked-in situation that all states get people locked into. It's a male-dominated state structure. They totally resisted that. But instead they have these communes, and they compromise, they prepared to compromise with national constitutions. For a while it looked promising that they might have, and it started working in Diyarbakir, and I saw some of that in 2014, but then Erdogan's regime clamped down on that, and it's very difficult now to maneuver in Turkey. In the culture, accommodates cultural and religious differences. It's a bit like we have. We tolerate cultural and religious differences. Many people think that the Middle East is just Arabs and Muslim, but this isn't. The Kurds are a mixture. The Kurds are a mixture of Muslim, they're a mixture of the Yazidi and Christian and Jewish. And self-defense. So I've seen that, you've seen that bit about the self-defense. I just want to, I think, how much time have I got left?
Sid, you've got about 4 minutes. Okay,
so look, I just want to go, let's see. So my problem, there's a deeper problem, is the linear history of society, and Jeremy has spoken about that you have this understanding of these these stages, and they've read, and Marxist-Leninist is also underpinned by a positivist materialist dialectic. Now, I don't want to go into all of that because that will take us too far, but I'll write a paper on this sometime. But the problem one is that does not account for the early rise of patriarchy. Much of Marxist-Leninist literature implies that patriarchy arose during the capitalist era. Remove capitalism and patriarchy goes with it. Öcalan, this is a quote from him, while at first I viewed the enslavement of women as a result of feudal backwardness, after many years of revolutionary practice, I came to the conclusion that the problem goes much deeper. The 5,000-year-old history of civilization is essentially a history of enslavement of women. So that was the first enslavement that they talk about, the enslavement of women, and goes back 5,000 years. He's written some lengthy books on that history. That is supported, in fact, by Graeber and Wengrow in their latest book, The Dawn of Everything, which I haven't read. I've only seen reviews of it. It isn't out in the bookshelves yet. But a more complex history than this what they call the standard narrative. The standard narrative, we all know it. It's people grew up as hunter-gatherers and then moved through these primitive communes and onward to various stages of feudalism, capitalism, and to socialism. So they see right from the beginning that wasn't happening. In the ancients, right, all along history, there's been this living side by side of groups that are not state type groups. In other words, that you don't have that strict structure of what we consider as, say, a present day city, which has a mayor and various other structures. It's much more loosely organized. And then, okay, so I don't want to go into all of this because that will take us I don't have much time. So, but the interesting thing is that I found so much in Marx that contradicts this kind of statist approach and this very rigid, what I call a clunky dialectics. So Marx, for example, and Lenin in the Communist Manifesto say, all fixed, frozen relationships, etc., with their venerable ideas and opinions are swept away. All new formed ones become obsolete before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into the air, and all that is holy is profaned. And another, so it's not that everything is changing, but if we go deeper into this, into real science, into the physics, nuclear physics, it's not that everything is changing, but all is flux. There's nothing that's fixed. Everything is fluxed. I think the best way to think of it is to think of, if you look at a stream of water, you'll see these bubbles and you'll see the ripples, but those bubbles and ripples are just momentary there. It's just the water that's flowing through them. They don't exist as separate things, those bubbles. They're just a movement. It's part of a movement of the water. And in their research, Wengrove and Graeber talked about what they found were the three freedoms in most of the societies that they uncovered and researched. Well, they didn't do too much original research. They just brought together a wealth of material that archaeologists have been researching for years now. So the three freedoms that are most cherished are the freedom to move, the freedom to disobey, and the freedom to create or transform social relationships. Freedom to move, so you don't have boundaries. You don't have state boundaries. You can move across them. You don't have provincial boundaries. You can move out of communes into other communes, and you'll know that you'll be welcomed in other communes. There's no kind of sanction against that. There's a freedom to disobey. If you don't agree with a person, you can engage with them and disobey. Well, then you have the freedom to move off if you like, but you're not going to be forced into any particular line of thinking. And then the freedom to create or transform social relationships, new ones. And I just want to end with this thing from David Graeber. Okay, so there's a number of things that I could go. There's a postscript. I could talk about this later. Diyarbakir changed between 2014 and 2019, and part of that area there was this attempt to form a separate commune. The government didn't like it, Erdogan, and they clamped down very heavily, and there was a big battle there. In fact, the resistance was crushed with the use of German tanks. A whole part of that beautiful old city was destroyed by these tanks. That was when I got there in 2019. Parts were walled off that I could easily walk into before, but that's another story.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you so much, Sid. It's lots to talk about. I'm unfortunately having to leave you, but I am going to hand over to Janet Cherry, who will take over from here. Thank you so much, and I'm hoping that the recording will be available because the discussions so far today have been very rich in the presentations as well. So Janet, I'm hoping you will be loading these for us to revisit and chew on.
Right. Thank you, Christy.
Yeah, thank you, Christy. Thanks very much.
Yeah. We'll relieve you. Thank you, Sid. Can you take off your screen? Okay. And then we'll let people have some discussion. So I'm going to take
damn. Let me just close. Let me just close myself for a bit.
I'll take about 20 minutes, maybe half an hour if people want to, on these two papers. I think they go very well together, and it's really a process of us exploring new or other forms of socialism and socialist experiments that are going on in other parts of the world or in other contexts. So I really appreciate both of the inputs, and I hope that some of the other people in the meeting here also have found them challenging and interesting and would like to respond in some way. I don't see any hands. Please feel free to respond, anybody. Gary, let's have Gary. Gary, unmute yourself, please.
Sid, I have also done some teaching on the Middle East, so I have followed these issues more than some. But I was actually missing the transformation of the outlook of the PKK. Could you just talk a little bit about the sort of the kind of time frame and how long was that political struggle to shift the outlook of the organization? And and I'm familiar with some of the communal movements that you're speaking of in northern Syria. How much are those directly connected to the PKK's transformation into a different kind of socialist outlook? Because I think if this can be validated, it's a very rare shift, I think, for a Marxist-Leninist organization to fully change its outlook and its character.
Yeah, Gary, I agree with you. It is a very rare shift. And I was astounded when I first read some of the books that Ssep had given me, that there was no reference to Lenin. And I thought, now, how is this possible? At that point in time, 3 Kurdish women came out to Cape Town for a big conference here. And I asked them about that, and they said, no, they shifted. And they've shifted beyond that. So I then investigated a bit and found out, and speaking to them as well, that you see, the PKK was founded in 1974. You probably know that, and it was founded as I said, a typical Marxist-Leninist, fighting for the freedom of the Kurds and for a separate Kurdish state. But I also pointed out that 2 of the founders were women, and one of the things that they had started doing was that the women in the organization started pressing people like Öcalan and others that, look, the problem is that we don't have freedom in our own society. We don't even have freedom in this organization. So what they had started moving then to the rural areas, the northern parts, the eastern parts of Turkey. And there they confronted well, they knew about it, but they really confronted this chieftainship problem. And a lot of the early work of the PKK was against male domination internally. And it was around about the mid-1990s that the shift started happening. And the pressure for the shift came from the women in the organization. And in particular, when they started moving, I showed you that picture of Öcalan going down to, well, he got trained in part of his training from the Palestinian Liberation Organization. But women then from Syria, from the northern part of Syria, were coming to meet with him. And he couldn't move into Syria itself easily. He eventually went up to that Rojava region. But by then, the women that had come to meet with him they decided that if you want to change society, you start with the women. They have the contacts, or they hold society together. And so the women had started, and they'd started building up very basic little women's groups. I mean, things that we would think as nothing spectacular. But it came over time. It only hit the news when ISIS was moving across that northern part of Syria, and they'd come from Iraq, and ISIS was uncontested, moving right across Syria, and they were blocked, particularly by the defense unit and led by the women's defense unit. They held out for about 30 days in this little town of Kobani. That's when I went over there. I was asked to go and take photographs of refugees, and I went right onto the border there. And so it was just a gradual process. I would say the mid-1990s, just before Öcalan got imprisoned, that they began to understand that they needed to move away from this hard line. Well, they associated Marxist-Leninism with patriarchy. I think, you know, if you read more deeply into Marx, it's perhaps not as bad as the Marxist-Leninist manifestation of the patriarchy is. But that's when it started. And they still, now the question of the connection to those other organizations, look, you have to view it in terms of like our UDF and the ANC and the SACP in the 1980s. There was a strong connection, but we couldn't validate that. In fact, we had to try and disprove that we were anything to, I was detained as well. And the one thing they wanted to prove was that I had connections with the MK and the ANC. Well, of course I had said no. And eventually they, all of us that were detained at that time, leaders of the UDF, were released. I was released quite early because I was a white priest, and so there was a lot of campaigning around my release. But it's difficult to validate that. The records will only come up over time, but I could certainly, there are people who I met who are located now in Belgium. So a lot of the Kurdish exile, the KCK is organized. They have a very strong organization in Europe. That's when I went on the Long March. I was invited to go and join them, going from Luxembourg to Strasbourg. It's an annual march on around the birthday of Öcalan.
Thanks,
I don't know if that answers your
question. Thanks, Sid. No, that's great. Maybe I can just ask Devin to respond to your question in relation to eco-socialism and the questions that have been come up around democratic decentralization and delinking, which came up in the previous session as well. In the light of COP26, what do you think is the future? I mean, you know, the slogan eco-socialism or barbarism. I mean, is there any alternative to eco-socialism, and can we delink? Who must delink? At what level does this delinking happen?
Oh, that's a very important question, but a very big one. My view on all of this, I'm very excited, as I've shown, about what's happening in a place like Rojava, which you could say is a type of delinking. Well, they're delinking from the Syrian state, and they're delinking from the whole idea of the state and doing something completely differently. So just bursting open all these mind traps that we've all been in. However, I'm also very much aware, and I've mentioned this to Sid in our discussions around this, that Rojava is a unique situation. It's a war situation. It's a liberated zone arising out of the peculiarities of a war situation. And the Syrian state tolerates them. The US government tolerates them. The Turkish want to obliterate them. So they're in this, very unique situation. Now, one doesn't want to exaggerate uniqueness of it and say it's not applicable anywhere else, but you can certainly draw inspiration about women's empowerment, real empowerment, not the fake empowerment we talk about in our daily discourse in South Africa and elsewhere. And there's a lot to be learned from about that. But the democratic confederalism, is it something we can just adopt, in our situation, South Africa, in other situations? Kerala is another example, or different kind of example. They are embedded in the Indian state, but the Communist Party and other left forces are trying to construct something very different. But they're not talking of delinking of the circuits of capital per se. They do take loans from the World Bank, I'm led to believe, for example, whether, which is subject to fierce debate. I'm a little bit wary of easy solutions. So the delinking of Samir Amin of the 1960s and 70s, he himself then also moved away from, because it led to closed economies and the oppressions that are inherent in that. I mean, we had an apartheid closed economy and the big monopolies that arose out of that. So there's a lot to mediate. But there's something what Öcalan's thinking, and I'm still getting into it. You know, he's written these volumes, and this is one a very, very thick volume. But he's got a very interesting new drawing from ancient history, but his understanding of the market is very interesting. Maybe Sid can also say more about this, which I haven't fully understood. But it's not hostile to the notion of the market, but it's a different understanding of the market and how the market can be a democratic space. In history, it was. The capitalist market is different, but the market or market relations can be a democratic space. So there's a lot of, so we've got to rethink all of this. And I'm just very hesitant about going back to old tropes about delinking. I'm not sure if Patrick is necessarily doing that. But we've got to really be imaginative in our thinking and perhaps not have a one-size-fits-all approach to this.
Right, thanks. And I think that also links back to what Patrick Brennan was saying about the market, that it's not necessarily anti-market. It's how do we relate to markets? How do we understand markets in a different way within different social relations? So it's not the market itself is the problem, but it's not quite the same as decommodification of everything, which is, what did he call it? Luxury communism. So, but I think we'll come back. Automated.
Yeah, I taught that book to my students. There's a lot of interesting ideas there about possibilities. Also something worth looking at,
So thanks, Devin, and thanks that we've got some very interesting ideas about the future, thinking in different ways about how socialism could be a reality. So I'm going to leave the discussion there. I don't have any more hands, but we're going to come back to these ideas related to the last two presentations. And I think it's now nearly 3:15. I'm just going to ask for a 5-minute break, comfort break, if people want to leave. And then we'll start at 20 past, and I'll ask Mazibuko Jara to give the second last presentation, which will be on the solidarity economy and the land question. So we're bringing in all these things which should be mainstreamed, including feminist understandings of socialism, ecological understandings of socialism, the land question, and so on. So we're going to, let me admit Comrade Majumbozi, and if we can just take a 5-minute break, and we'll reconvene for the last panel at 3:20. Thanks, everybody. Don't go offline. We'll be back in a minute. Hello, Ariana. I see you've joined us. I don't know if you're there.
Janet, were you chatting to me?
I was just saying hello because I saw you. I saw you were there.
Yes, I'm sorry I missed this morning. I had to participate in a handover of the papers of Dr. Tim Williams to the Adler Museum at Wits. So that's why I wasn't online. I'm very sorry, but I hope it went well and I hope to catch the recording.
Yeah, no, it was good. I think Jeremy Cronin did a good job. And we've also had some, did you hear Sid Luckett and Devan Pillay's presentations?
I just got Sid and the end of the conversation now, yes.
Yeah, so that's great. Okay, so let's go on. Mazibuko, I see you there. I think I'm going to start the last session of the afternoon. And Ariana, Ariana?
Yes, Janet?
Can I ask you to do me a favor?
Yes.
When I've introduced Mazibuko, can you chair the end of the session just because I'm going to be presenting? So I just need somebody else to take over. I had another chair for the first part of the session, but she had to leave.
Yes, so how much time does everybody have?
20 to 25 minutes, 25 max. And then we've got a bit of time for discussion.
That's fine, absolutely.
So I'm going to make you a co-host.
Okay.
So that you can have some control.
So is this session just you and Mazibuko?
Yeah, so just let me address everybody this afternoon. Welcome back, everybody. I'm going to ask Ariana to take over as chair, but welcome Mazibuko. I had apologies, which I attended earlier, from Jenny Schreiner, who, as you also are aware, is one of the leaders of the South African Communist Party, but I'm afraid she's unwell, so she has given her apologies. And so we're going to ask Mazibuko to speak first on the solidarity economy and the land question. And Mazibuko, he's a democratic Marxist, feminist, socialist feminist, and he's been involved in many things, but he's the director of Mtingantaba Kandoda, a rural development movement and development project, and is also on the board of the ARDC in Cape Town. I think many of you have worked with him. And I thought, Mazibuko, are you still a research associate at UCT, at the Law and Justice Center? He's a research associate at UCT. And yeah, over to you, Mazibuko. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Comrade Janet. Good afternoon to everyone. Unfortunately, my rural Wi-Fi means that I have to switch off my face, the video.
We can hear
Otherwise,
you.
it will keep switching off. It just keeps switching off if I've got the camera on. So I just have to switch it off now. So I'll present without my face showing, if that's okay with everyone. So the topic is about the solidarity economy approach to resolving the land question in South Africa. Somewhat different from the last session we had now and the morning session, which I missed. So I'll go right ahead. Most of the debate and discussion on the land issue is dominated by technical questions. Who should benefit from redistribution? How should beneficiaries be identified? How should land be acquired and transferred? What kind of rights should people hold on redistributed land? And such other questions. Of course, I'm labeling these as technical, but of course, they are fundamentally political. And by referring to a solidarity economy approach to resolving the land question, we want to approach these questions with a more stronger political lens, with a more stronger political economy lens, and then hopefully to use the land question to also connect to other dynamics of South African society, particularly in relation to the state. So obviously, even the private sector does accept that the state has a role in land redistribution, in agrarian reform and agricultural revival. But it's always useful to think about the role of the state to date, since 1994, when it comes to agriculture and the land question. To date, in the mainstream of agricultural policy, what we've seen the state doing is deregulation and liberalization, going back to 1996 with the Marketing of Agricultural Products Act, which basically, in one foul move, removed the entire flow of support that apartheid had provided to white farmers. And this was happening at the same time as the new government was launching restitution and also beginning to put in place elements of what would constitute a land reform program. Now, that deregulation and liberalization has resulted in the concentration and consolidation processes in commercial agriculture, where you've got fewer and fewer farmers. In fact, many of those farmers moving away from individual ownership to corporate ownership. So fewer and fewer entities, farming entities. But at the same time, you've seen actual farms being consolidated from smaller farms to bigger farms. So these are the two tendencies which deregulation and liberation has reinforced at the time, in the era when we should have been experiencing redistributive land reform. So this is quite an important point to note with regards to the role the state played. Who did the state facilitate to benefit and accumulate from land and agriculture? This concentration and consolidation, being driven by deregulation and liberalization, was also accompanied by a stronger global interactions between South African agriculture and the rest of global value chains in agriculture, whether it is the determination of the prices of maize in the Chicago Board of Trade, or South Africa's integration into global value chains, whether it's supply, whether it's production itself, or post-production, in a range of agricultural products. So the state has facilitated all of those, partly under the logic of attracting global investments, also the logic of being a global player. And this has had severe consequences. If you take a place like Lephalale, where Cyril Ramaphosa has a number of farms, there's about 50 game farms in the city of Lephalale, and also a few agricultural farms. Why is there all concerned with what happens to the Eskom power station there in terms of water supply? But actually, it's the fact that those 50 game farms are owned largely by foreign capital raises a very fundamental question. If the state were to negotiate land reform in Lephalale, who would it negotiate with, on which basis? Is there even social capital around which a patriotic agenda could be built for redistributive land reform? So that's just an example of the implication of allowing, without any strategic consideration, global penetration into South African agriculture. The second role the state has played has been about promoting a segment of Black farmers to join the big boys in commercial agriculture. So there's been a significant focus on commercialization of Black farmers for a small segment of them to join the big boys. This has been less successful compared to deregulation and liberalization for a range of reasons, including limited partnership options from mainstream agriculture, but also limited funding from the state to facilitate the very commercialization agenda. As the above, the two things have happened: deregulation and liberalization, and some limited measure of Black commercialization of a small segment of farmers. You also have seen several pillars in land and agriculture, several institutions of the state collapsing, or at least being severely weakened. The Agricultural Research Council no longer has the research capacity or the financial resources to drive a transformative agenda when it comes to land and agrarian reform. Similarly, when it comes to the two departments, it was previously Department of Land Affairs and Department of Agriculture, but now they've taken new other forms. But basically, those two key pillars have also been weakened severely, and most importantly, there has been poor coordination between the two of them. Also important with regards to public institutions is the role played by universities. There were significant agricultural universities in the past, including Forte, which used to provide an important support role to the Agricultural Research Center and to the departments of agriculture and other related departments. Now those have also devolved away from public service to commercialization of their services. So this picture speaks to the role of the state, but also the weakening of the state if we were to look at the role of state from the perspective of a transformative agenda. To relate these experiences in South Africa to broader agrarian political economy debates, I argue that what has happened since 1994 has basically been the final stages of resolving the agrarian question of capital. In other words, the full transition to a full-blown capitalism in agriculture, which of course dispossession, apartheid, and the related land and agricultural laws had facilitated. But then the post-1994 dispensation basically completed that transition to capitalism in agriculture, leading to these higher levels of concentration and consolidation. In other words, if we were to talk about a solidarity economy approach, we have to recognize this situation. And put differently, this situation is one where the political conditions for redistributive land reform basically are not really existent if you take into account the role of the state to date, but also the relative strengthening of agrarian capital as I've described. Compared to that relative strengthening of agrarian capital, the popular forces, those in the former homelands, those who are farm workers and farm dwellers in the former Republic of South Africa have been relatively weakened, even with a minimum wage determination for farm workers, even with some social measures for education and health for farm workers. Those have not changed the political balance of forces. So the state in its prism, the state in its policy considerations, in its strategic considerations, does not consider these popular forces as that kind of a significant factor to shape what the state does and how it allocates resources. I do not have time to go through the budget allocations over the years, which confirm how unimportant land reform actually has been in the policy decisions of the state. In addition to what I've said, there are 5 other aspects of the agrarian crisis, which I want to point out and then explain why then the solidarity economy approach is crucial and relevant. Sort of pointed to up to now as the first one is the role of the state, and also within that the capacity of the state. That is also explained by the bigger, by the more larger question that looms large in this, the inequity in land ownership. That's a key aspect, and many of the solutions being put forward do not see redistributive land reform as key. There are rather limited approaches to redistribution, which seek to focus on continuing with food production. Yes, it is important, but it does not then mean that the historical question of land inequity should not be addressed. So that's the second aspect of the agrarian crisis in South Africa, because it means that food will continue to be produced by a small segment of commercial farmers, and then the rest of us will basically continue to be dependent on them, which leads then to the third aspect. We are a food secure country, but we're not food sovereign. If you look at food sovereignty at community level across all sorts of working class communities in the urban context, in the rural context, and in inner cities and so on. And as such then, the massive numbers of poverty, of hunger, food deprivation, malnutrition, and so on, that are still a dominant feature of South African society, despite 27 years of freedom. The next feature, the next aspect of the agrarian crisis is the industrialized form of agricultural production. In essence, it's a fossil fuel base of production, whether it's fertilizer, whether it's a whole range of inputs, particularly petrol and diesel, that shape what happens on the actual farms in South Africa. What that means specifically is that South Africa in the world has one of the most exhausted soils because of sustained chemical inputs into the system. The problem with fertilizer is that it does give you higher yields, but each and every passing year, you have to add more and more fertilizer, which destroys soil life in order to maintain the yields. Similarly, when it comes to seed and other things, which you have to continuously buy on a yearly basis, but more importantly, commercialized seed, hands over seed knowledge, seed control, seed production, seed distribution to private capital in ways that can actually undermine a land reform agenda. Those are some of the key aspects which I think are essential in thinking about the agrarian crisis in South Africa today. I'm keen then to move to what I mean by the solidarity economy approach in response to these key aspects. The first element of the approach thinks about the state. The formulation I put forward is captured by three words: with, beyond, and against the state. With, insofar as the state is a legitimate state, insofar as the state should be providing public goods, and also the state has a historic mandate to resolve what is a crucial question from the struggle against apartheid. Against the state, insofar as the state is a neoliberal state, is a corrupt state, is captured by elements which actually are not for a radical agenda. So we definitely have to go beyond asking for support from the state to actually challenge the state in quite significant ways for it to deliver on its mandate, but also to challenge some of the dominant logics that inform how the state operates. Beyond the state, insofar as the state, even if it was not a neoliberal state, but actually, if we learn even from the Rojava example, there are in the age of late capitalism, there are some objective limits to the state in terms of what the state can actually deliver for radical, thoroughgoing socio-economic transformation. This is where then we can learn a lot from movements in Latin America. So in response to the climate crisis, a movement like the MST, the Landless Workers Movement in Brazil, has been able to occupy land that was owned by Monsanto and to do two things with that land. One, to establish a Latin American school of agroecology, and then also a political school for rural activists. The Latin American School of Agroecology is important because what it does is to move away from fossil fuel-based agricultural production to agricultural production that works with nature, that works with ecological biodiversity, and that is more resilient to climate change, producing hundreds of cadres who can actually go back to communities and even challenge state policies and reorient what the state does in this regard. So that's an example of a movement that has gone beyond the state to demonstrate what is possible. Also, with regards to the state, I think it's still going to be important, though, to focus on rebuilding new capacities in the state for effective land and agrarian reform, but also, very importantly, for sectoral interventions in the agricultural value chain, but also, very importantly, a conducive macroeconomic policy, and also ensuring sufficient fiscal allocations. This may sound like a pipe dream, given, for example, the medium-term budget policy statement we saw this week. I think what I'm raising there is the need for rebuilding forces that can challenge what happens in state processes to take decisions on the issues I've raised. And that challenge is not going to be met with kid gloves, given how entrenched neoliberalism is at Treasury and in the presidency and key parts of the ANC. But also, there is the inordinate power of private capital, which looms large in the thinking of the state, particularly now in the value chain. If you look, for example, at the supply industry to agriculture, or even the post-farm activities, whether it's distribution, whether it's consumption, whether it's retail, how those are dominated by big capital. So any changes in agriculture actually also go, or even in what happens in the treasury are going to be shaped by that inordinate power of private capital. So what we are seeing on the ground is interesting, though, because people who are particularly in the former homelands, are actually preoccupying themselves with nascent elements of a solidarity economy, attempting to reconstruct society, attempting to rethink power, and building an alternative power, but at the same time engaging with the state and going beyond the state. So let me give you a few examples in this regard. There's a general approach of regarding the land as a commons, and constructing the land as something that's got social functions beyond individual-based accumulation processes. So there's a small farmer system and logic that's present. That's not about expanding into large farms. Partly because of limited resources, people have been forced to look for innovative methods, somewhat linked to indigenous knowledge, but also the reality of climate change factoring in as well, where there's what people refer to as agroecological production methods, which are more resilient to climate change and minimize costs. Those have included initiatives such as seed saving, seed banks, low-cost processing, and even innovative ways of exchange, distribution, and consumption. The organization I'm part of, partnered with the University of Fort Hare to do research on where people in Kaskamauk buy their food. And we discovered that 70% of pensioners, they also receive the Social Security grant, bought most of their food in the Kaskamauk CBD. And once we discovered that, we then decided to organize a monthly farmers market, because local farmers were complaining about not being able to get their supplies bought by Pick n Pay and ShopRite and Spar in King Williamstown. And that kind of local Kaskamauk farmers market has actually begun to generate other local economic activities, people going beyond primary products, yogurt, cheese, material they've sewn, and other things, clothing that they've made themselves. So that's an example of what can be possible in a very small way in terms of restructuring markets. And then if it had state support, you can imagine what could happen and in terms of the impact of that. The solidarity economy approach has also seen local actors imagining and practicing out a form of appropriate extension. The country has about 5,000 extension officers in the cultural sector. By and large, those 5,000 extension officers are promoting commercial products from Panar, from other commercial cultural companies. But agroecology has seen small farmers being extension officers to themselves, have seen small farmers being the certifiers, group peer certifiers of organic products, what is called participatory guarantee systems, in ways that have lowered the costs of organic certification, in ways that have expanded knowledge, in ways that have learned from farmers, in ways that a state-led extension system cannot imagine, because the state-led extension system is based on a particular format and then finds it fairly difficult to adjust to dynamics from below. Another example, which again,
Mazibuko, sorry to interrupt you. You've been speaking for 20 minutes, so just asking you to begin to wrap up in the next couple of minutes, please.
Okay, I'll do so in 2 minutes. Another one is the availability of tractors and the use of tractors. The state has focused on buying new tractors on a massive scale in not everywhere. Whereas if there was a different approach of actually identifying local tractors that are available and working out a local system where training and maintenance is key, and then linking state support to the use of such, it would make a difference. I don't have time to talk about water access and value chain restructuring and urban agriculture and land occupation as examples of other pillars of a solidarity economy approach. But what is going to be key still, the solidarity economy approach is limited if there's no significant land redistribution. I can speak later on about what kinds of land can be available or should be targeted for a massive redistribution program. So in conclusion, the solidarity economy approach is one that goes beyond the state. Whilst it depends on and needs the state, but at the same time is one that begins to open up avenues that limited state options may not explore. Ultimately, though, that solidarity economy approach is going to be hemmed in, is going to be subordinated by neoliberal policy, particularly when it comes to macroeconomic policy. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm sorry for rushing you the last couple of minutes. Janet, are we moving over to you, and then we'll have a joint discussion of the two papers. So let me introduce you briefly. Professor Janet Cherry is an activist and professor of development studies at Nelson Mandela University. She's published on various aspects of South Africa's liberation struggle, not least in the SADC series, as well as issues of human rights and social justice. And your paper today is titled Emancipatory Scholarship and Prefigurative Strategies for Building Socialism Today. Over to you, Janet. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you, Ariana. And, you know, I was thinking when Mazibuko was speaking that we should have changed the order around and had Patrick Brennan in this session and Mazibuko in the last session. But actually, I think it's going to work out quite well, especially since Mazibuko started talking about the role of the universities. And I think his contribution on solidarity economy was really interesting and relates to a little bit of what I'm going to say. I'm going to try and share my screen here. Can you see my screen?
Yes, all good.
Great, okay, excellent. So, I don't know, for some reason I can't see it now. Yeah, I'm going to...
We see the title page, basically. At the moment.
Okay, so I'm going to hinge my talk about emancipatory scholarship and prefigurative socialism on two people, on Ruth First and Matthew Conway, and I think you'll both be familiar with them. So both of them were communists, both critical intellectuals who played a very important role in the struggle in South Africa, but were also quite independent thinkers, and their role was quite quite interesting for the reasons of what they tried to do and what kind of experiments they engaged in. Closing my door because I've got a rooster who's making a big noise. So this post, the first poster, the first picture is an ANC poster in Portuguese from Mozambique after Ruth first was assassinated in 1982. And we talked a bit earlier about, some of the other presenters talked about Rick Turner, who had a big influence on them. He had a big influence on me as well, and he was also assassinated. Interestingly enough, as Ruth First and both Matthew Conway had a big influence on me. This is Matthew, the poster or picture of a banner, South African Communist Party banner, made for the funeral of the Cradock Four, which was in June 1985. And this was also, obviously, I mean, Matthew Conway was assassinated as well. I'm not going to talk at all about their assassination and why they were killed and so on. I'm going to talk more about what their thinking was and what role they played. So I just wanted to, say, so both of them were educators, researchers, but also activists and revolutionaries, and played this role in the context of South Africa in the late 1970s and early 1980s. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about Ruth first in relation to the socialist experiment in Mozambique and her role there, and secondly about Matthew Conway's role in Lingelihle township in Cradock in the early 1980s. Now I'm going to look in turn at the influence on them of other socialist theorists, including Antonio Gramsci and Jeremy Cronin referred earlier to Gramsci, very influential on many of us as young activists, and of Paulo Freire, the South American educator. And then I'm lastly going to look at what was the relationship of these people to the SACP and what are the lessons for building socialism today. So firstly, if we look briefly at Ruth First and her, what I call emancipatory scholarship, this is in the context of the late 70s, early 80s in Mozambique, where she was director of the Center for African Studies at Eduardo Mondlane University. And what she did was she trained a whole generation of Mozambican Frelimo government officials in the new socialist government in how to do action research, well, empirical research really on conditions of workers and rural peasants in Mozambique, and use this to develop, firstly to support the Frelimo government in its development of socialist policies, and secondly to critique their policies as well. So she was certainly no hack. And so basically this team of researchers gave critical support to Frelimo in its transition to socialism. So Rob Davies, who we talked about earlier in terms of his role as Minister of Trade and Industry in South Africa, he was working for, I think for about 10, 11 years, in fact, at that Center for Development Studies in Eduardo Mondlane University, Center for African Studies. And he says that she championed the view that research aimed at critical support could contribute significantly to the building of socialism in Mozambique. And an example of this, and this relates to what Mazibuko was talking about, she was critical of the state farm policy and the emphasis on state-run, top-down, centralized enterprises, and supported cooperative production. And she came to the conclusion, well, the CEA, the center came to the conclusion that there'd been little transformation in the relations of production in terms of agriculture in Mozambique. Let's relate this to cooperatives. So they were quite involved and quite supportive of neighborhood cooperatives which were involved with food distribution. These weren't actually production cooperatives, but she said, I mean, this is Rob Davies' recent book. He says they saw these neighborhood cooperatives as both creating immediate income generating opportunities and as the best available route to socialize the relations of production, in this case in the countryside, emphasizing the reappropriation of control over the means of production by the producers. So I'm trying to draw on her experience and the way in which she conducted research, as well as what they actually did in Mozambique, to try and see how we can, through action research, empower people to take control over production of energy, food, and waste. Well, not production of waste, reuse of waste in industrial production in these cooperatives that we are trying to establish, neighborhood cooperatives in KwaZulu. And Patrick talked a bit about that in the context of decentralizing industrial production. And this is, I mean, in fact, we had Ronnie Caswell's visited our project at an early stage and referred to these neighborhood cooperatives as gap-tap Soviets, just to refer back to Patrick's reference to Soviets and electrification. But there are serious limits to this, and we can discuss that maybe in the discussion. But for me, as an educator, it's also a very important lesson in terms of the type of scholarship that we do and how universities engage with the state, and whether we can build socialist alternatives within the context of the current South African state. So Jeremy argued, and this was in a paper that he shared with me last year sometime, popular forces tend, in South Africa this is, tend not to be mobilized as protagonists, as productive agents in building a new society. Rather, they are mobilized as righteous beneficiaries of state delivery. And in a way, what we are trying to do is to reverse that and change relations of production through creating new productive forces, through taking control over, in some respects, common assets, maybe state assets, and existing assets, and enabling ordinary working class residents of townships, doesn't have to be though, but it could be it is in this case, to take control as both managers and workers of production facilities. And the assumption is that with new technology, specifically photovoltaic solar energy, this can be decentralized, and in fact it is the most effective and efficient way of providing energy, which I'm not going to go into the energy debate here, but I'm sure if you've been following the developments in renewable energy and the COP26 debate, you'll be aware of this. So just to reflect back on Ruth First's understanding of development, she was very critical of technocratic and statist solutions. And she did see the possibility of social transformation. And even, as you know, what happened in Mozambique as it descended into a civil war, which was backed by Renamo, being backed by the South African apartheid regime. And that experiment basically collapsed under that pressure. She did see the possibility of social transformation, but what she says is that this kind of change cannot be bureaucratically improvised from above without the mobilization of the masses of the people and without their assertion of their need for social control of the productive forces and the political systems of their country. So she's saying it's not one or the other. She's also not separating it out into two stages. Yeah? So let me move on to Matthew Goniwe. Matthew, interesting, also an independent Marxist thinker. Very interestingly, the recent book biography of him by Mazibuko, which is really interesting and really nicely written book, claims that he joined the Communist Party in 1960, when he would have been 12 years old, which I think is quite unlikely, but anyway, within the local context, that was the understanding of people who were living in that community, that he had joined the Communist Party, and he was very excited about it. He was a real organic intellectual of his community, and he had an impact far beyond his community. So interestingly enough, he was influenced by many of the new left in Europe, as well as Rosa Luxemburg, Gramsci, as well as many African influential writers, Amilcar Cabral, and people from the more Trotskyist left, Fanon, Ivy Tabata, and so on. He read literature across the ideological divide. Lungisile, who was working with him in a Marxist reading group, or Marxist project, can I say, in the Transkei in the 70s, described him as being unapologetically Marxist and non-sectarian. But what I found most extraordinary about Matthew Goniwe's legacy was his development of a local, innovative, creative, counter-hegemonic strategy, which was based on the real empowerment of ordinary people. Interestingly enough, Sid, it draws a lot on the Latin American experience of basic Christian communities, as well as, I think you talked about them. Anyway, you can maybe come back and respond to that, which was drawn on in Cape Town, to my knowledge, and I think in Durban maybe as well in the early 80s, in terms of building community organization around taking up, winning victories by taking up real issues that affected people's lives. This is an extract from Matthew's notebook, where you can see his talking about the new approach to organization, mobilization, and education, which emerged after 1970 something, an approach which empowered, which emphasized grassroots democratic organization around issues which directly affect people. So that was the socialist tradition that I and many of my comrades at that time grew up in. As an educator, and Matthew Goniwe was a school teacher who became a principal, science and math teacher, by the way, was also strongly influenced by Paulo Freire and the idea of critical and emancipatory education. And what this influence did was enable him to bridge the gap between theory and practice. And for him, people's education was a revolutionary system that served the aims of the People's Revolution. This is how Mazibuko described it, which would prioritize the development of the people, and they would use education as a tool to liberation in South Africa. And what was also interesting about this was a strong emphasis on the new person, i.e. the creation of somebody who is emancipated as a human being, who can realize their full potential, who is in their practice, in their personal practice, is disciplined and respectful of everybody, and so on. I mean, non-racist, non-sexist, things that we talk about, but which in fact Matthew and his comrades encouraged in practice. So just let me show you here. Okay, let me go back here. So let me look quickly at the relationship of Matthew Goniwe and Ruth First to the SACP. So Ruth First, I think we know, I mean, she was a member of the CPSA, and then after she was released from prison and went into exile, she was a member of the SACP, and yet she was able to be critical of it and was never an unquestioning follower of the line, and came into frequent conflict with Joe Slovo, her husband, about matters of doctrine and what the line was from the Comintern. I think that is quite detailed description of that in Alan Vader's book on Ruth First and Joe Slovo. Matthew Goniwe was part of he claimed to have, well, people claim that he joined the Communist Party in 1960. I would love older comrades here, maybe on this platform, who are aware of this, to corroborate whether he was a member at any stage before his death or before his release from prison in 1981. But I'm accepting that he understood himself to be a member through his recruitment by his, I think it was his uncle, Jacques, who then joined MK and who died in the Wankie campaign, or Sipolilo campaign in 1968. So Matthew went to the Transkei as a teacher, and together with Dumisa and Lungisile Mtsebeza and others, they formed an organization they called the People's United Front for the Liberation of South Africa. And they existed for quite a long period of time, engaging in Marxist study groups. They were a revolutionary organization. I do not think they had a direct connection with the SACP, but Matthew might have had a relationship himself. I'll show you here. This is that Lungisile Ntsebeza sent this to me. This is the Pafilsa document, which sets out their aims and objectives. And he says here, there's no mention of the SACP at all, but they do recognize. So they say what befell organizations such as the ANC, the PAC, and the NUA, the Unity Movement at the beginning of the 60s, how as a result of this, they became expatriate organizations. We've also stated that it is the aim of Pafilsa to revive and advance the tradition of a programmed struggle which the expatriate organizations had started, but which was broken by police harassment at the beginning of the 60s. We are aware of the fact that the expatriate organizations are even at this moment making commendable efforts outside to revive the unbroken tradition, the broken tradition. We, however, contend that an organization such as Pafilsa, which is firmly based inside the country, is not only in a position to revive the broken tradition, but also to advance it in the light of the revolutionary situation now obtaining in Southern Africa. And now, of course, the struggle would take longer than they intended, but Matthew was released in 1981, went back to Cradock, and immediately started building these extraordinary organizations, organs of people's power. They didn't start as organs of people's power, but they started as street committees, civic organizations, combined youth, civic, women's organizations taking up local issues. By 1980, yeah,
sorry to interrupt. No, it's been 20 minutes, just letting you know. So if you could begin to wrap up, please.
Yeah, I'm wrapping up.
Thank
you. You know, he set up Marxist study groups as they had done in the Transkei, and I think many others. Devin probably was also involved in setting up Marxist study groups. They taught the basic principles of Marxist theory. Now, Mike Tettleman, who wrote a thesis about Cradock and intergenerational struggle, he notes it's unclear if Conway saw the study group as a way to recruit for the SACP, for his relationship to the SACP remains unclear. Yet the study group had a deeper purpose than increasing students' political awareness. He saw the group as a valuable instrument to maintain discipline in the light of rising unrest. It's interesting. I asked other comrades what they knew about his relationship to the SACP, and Obed Bapela responded to me the other day, and he said he was an underground member who belonged to the Marxist tendency at one point, and then he said he became a more mainstream in the underground of the SACP, and we can discuss that. But there's some common features of both of these two individuals, both in terms of their alignment, their political orientation, their overt anti-Stalinism, their absolute revolutionary commitment to the national democratic struggle and to the ANC, for which they both died, and their feminism as well in terms of their personal practice. But both of them explored critical education and organizational practices quite outside the sort of Marxist-Leninist orthodoxies of the SACP. And I think in conclusion, you know, what this indicates in terms of our broader emphasis on the lineages of socialism is how it indicates a breadth of thinking and a creativity in the socialist tradition and in strategic thinking in South Africa. And that the influence of the SACP was not perhaps as rigid as is sometimes portrayed. So that there were revolutionary intellectuals like these who could explore creative strategies and that we can learn from today in terms of trying to build socialism in the interstices of capitalism, as others have been talking about. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Janet. I know we lost Mazibuko along the way, and I only noticed you were in the waiting room after a while. I hope you didn't miss a lot. But let me, I just want to pin Mazibuko. Oh, you see there's people in the waiting room. Are you there, Mazibuko, now? I can't, here you are, yes.
I'm back, yeah.
Yes, great. Let me open it up for questions and comments from the audience. I see Alison Drew's got a comment in the chat. Fascinating discussion. What about Neville Alexander as a Marxist intellectual? Is there anyone else that would like to come in? Please either raise your hands or unmute or put your comments in the chat. Anyone?
I see Gary.
Thanks. I'm not sure why. Let me put it like this. Please go ahead, Gary. Thanks, Janet. I can see everyone now.
Mazibuko, have you had a chance to do some thinking about the current legislation that's in Parliament? There was the kind of national level. I know you're focused on other initiatives. Have you had a chance to think about the potential interaction between decisions that could be made at the national level on land questions, land redistribution, that could positively impact some of the more grassroots and bottom-up initiatives that you're studying? I've done a lot of work on Brazil, and of course the MST is a very powerful grassroots movement, but it did also have almost 15 years of having at least a partial ally in the Brazilian government and some of the issues that were either achieved or not achieved there. So I'm just curious if you've had a chance to think about that question, since the Parliament does, at least at some point, likely to consider the legislation on land redistribution.
Should I answer immediately or
I think go ahead, Mazibuko, and answer. I see there's a question for Devan in the chat. Meantime, Devan, if you would like to look at that. So please go ahead, Mazibuko.
Thanks. I'll digress a bit in response to Gary's question. In South Africa, Gary, the challenge is that we have not yet reached the critical achievement in Brazil. Quite a lot of diffuse, diverse local organization that's not coalescing sufficiently to be a critical factor. There is an emergence of the national land movement. It would impact much more on the national parliament, on the national state, even in provincial government level, if it was much more stronger than it is. There are two crucial areas where the national state can be very crucial to change the dynamic on the ground. The fiscus is the first one. The budget for land reform and agriculture have been declining over the last 20 years. If that were to change, it would dynamize all sorts of things, whether it is supplies, whether it is redistribution of land itself, or whether it is post-settlement support. The national fiscus is a major gap here in a significant way. Secondly, the constitutional amendment is another area where the national political dynamic is critical. Unfortunately, the discussion on the constitutional amendment has focused narrowly on expropriation without compensation. Learning again from Brazil, there is, for example, a provision in legislation and in the constitution in Brazil on the social function of land, in a way that begins to conceptualize land as a common land, as a common heritage, as common property, as opposed to privatized property, which is the starting point in South Africa. So those two, the fiscus and reconceptualizing land as a common with a social function, would send a very different signal, would even galvanize and mobilize social forces on the ground in a more sustained way. But over and above those two, the state has significant land, whether it's municipal commonage, whether it's land in the park boards, or even land owned by state-owned enterprises, or even government departments. There's no creativity about how state-owned land can be used right away to meet at least immediate livelihood needs, or even local economic development needs beyond livelihood. The social forces that are on the ground are also not sufficiently organized to impact on the state, even when it comes to what the state already owns. That's how far I can go, Gary. Thank you.
So you want me to
Thanks
comment?
very much. Yes, there's a question for Devin in the chat about what an eco-socialist program proposed with regards to the electricity crisis.
Yes.
You want to take that? Thanks, Devin.
Thanks. Well, my first point to make is that eco-socialism adopts a view that socialism is not statism. Now, that is, of course, the 20th century perspective, that statism and socialism are the same thing. Whether it's a social democratic perspective or a Marxist-Leninist perspective, it's all about the state control and state-owned enterprises being a key pillar of that. That, in my understanding of of a 21st century socialist perspective, or democratic socialist perspective, is that socialism is about the empowerment of society, right? Now, in that context, I'm very disappointed in many of the traditional left responses regarding ESCOM, whether it's from my comrades in the AIDC or from Zwelinzima Vavi, who thinks that the whole ESCOM thing is a conspiracy to privatize it, etc. These are just knee-jerk 20th century responses that don't understand the nature of ESCOM as this monolith dinosaur that has, as we know, immense bureaucratic internal problems, even if we leave aside the issues of corruption, which are deeply embedded in it. So what is, I think from an eco-socialist perspective, what is required is a move towards decentralization. And that can take many forms, but falling through on the socially owned renewable energy perspective promoted by NUMSA back then, before it reverted to type, Marxist Leninist type, where, in its eco-socialist moment. And they've got a range of interesting proposals around decentralization. But learning from what has been happening in places like Sweden, Germany, elsewhere, about how communities can provide renewable energy for their own consumption as well as selling back to the grid is a very exciting possibility that needs massive support. So these will be income generating activities for communities, as well as providing energy to the grid. And then local governments coming into play to assist, to facilitate these, etc. So for me, that's a major starting point. So breaking up of ESCOM is critical. It has to be broken up. It's the idea that ESCOM now should provide all the renewable energy, all these billions coming from foreign capital, just going through ESCOM and everything happens through ESCOM. I think it's a very dangerous idea. Of course, there's still a role for ESCOM to play, and the energy mix, I don't disagree entirely with Devan Pillay, who talks about an energy mix, and you can't move away from coal overnight. Surely, that's a truism. But it's the pace of change and how fast we embrace renewable energy, including private sector players as well.
Thanks, Devin. Janet, did you see Alison's message in the chat about the concept of a study group? And I suppose Alison is referring to her work on the Yuchichan Club. Alison, would you like to come in? Or should, if not, then I see Jeremy's hand is up. So let me take Jeremy's comment or question and then give you a chance to respond.
No, thanks, Ariana. Thanks very much. A huge appreciation for the 4 inputs this afternoon. So let me begin with Mazibuko's input, which I thought was brilliant, and as always, I would say. And I particularly liked the way in which he framed the approach to the agrarian crisis in South Africa. The framing, which particularly excited me, was the notion of, in regard to the state, he said it's a question of working with the state. After all, it is a legitimate, relatively legitimate, perhaps we should say, state, but also against it, but also beyond it. And I think that that I think captures the broader challenges that we've got, not just on the agrarian crisis front, but more generally, and which is what I found so useful about this process that you, Ariana, that Janet and others have been facilitating to mark the SACP centenary year, but to engage in a broader left discussion in a non-sectarian way, so that we begin to think how to deal with the challenges that we've got as South Africans. And I think there's a lot of commonality and and obviously no doubt differences. So I just wanted to underline that aspect of Mazibuko's input. I think obviously he was focusing in terms of land reform on the agrarian side of things, but clearly a major issue with land reform is the whole bad urbanization, which I spoke about earlier, and the reproduction of apartheid social spaces through the kind of urbanization patterns that are happening. So I think one would just want to add that if one was looking at the broader questions of land reform. And then what I liked about Janet and Mazibuko was that the Sid's input and a lot of Devin's inputs are absolutely fascinating. And obviously the Kurdish struggle and the Rojava experiment, learning from David Graeber and Frederici, a whole wide range of left streams and currents, I think is absolutely important. But what I liked about what Janet was doing is that she was also drawing us into South African examples, because obviously the Kurdish situation is quite different to our own situation, which is not to say there's not a huge amount to admire and to learn from. And the same with these range of eco-socialist and other important contributions that are being made to the socialist project, to revitalizing Marxism, if you want to call it that. All of that's important, but I think at the same time, it's so important to remember the Goniwes, the Ruth Firsts, the Neville Alexanders, and I'm sure Alison will come in on this, and their particular contribution to helping us to develop adequate responses to the reality that we're confronting. And then the last point I want to make, so I'm not really asking questions, is that I think one of the issues, apart from the usual left sectarianism, and no doubt from various sides, and the SACP is not necessarily, is certainly not exempt from those tendencies. One of the issues that developed in the course of the 90s and into the early 2000s was a huge gap opening up between the university space and certainly the Communist Party, the SACP. And I think that has been problematic, certainly for the party, because there's obviously a lot of interesting and fertile stuff happening globally in terms of left rethinking. And that's what I've really appreciated about some of the sessions that I've been involved in this series. Yeah, so I just wanted to hope that we can go beyond the centenary of the SACP in some form to continue these kinds of discussions, so that we're not just marking the SACP's centenary, whether very critically or less critically, but that we try to find avenues and ways of increasing this fertilization, cross-fertilization, with critical debate and discussion. Yeah, so those are just some remarks I wanted to make. Thanks, Ariana.
Thanks, Jeremy. Alison, I see you are unmuted. If you would like to come in, please go ahead.
I don't know how to raise my hand. The only point I was making was just what I said, that I think it's worth giving more attention to the concept of the study group as it was used in South Africa during the underground period. That's really when it came to the fore as one of the few possible political forms, because before that you could have open discussions, but from 1960 on, you really couldn't. So it also allows one to move beyond the confines of political parties. So it's worth looking at for that reason.
Thanks very much. Certainly in the 70s period, study groups were very fertile places for discussion. At the time, the liberation movements were all banned. There are more comments in the chat. I'm just going to read Robert van Niekerk's comment. Janet, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it. It's question for Janet: how can we build on the traditions and legacies of Ruth First and Matthew Goniwe to build more systematic dialogues across the left on an inclusive, non-sectarian basis that includes but extends beyond the party? Maybe we need to reform as a labor movement or on a radical minimum program. example, Olaf Palme type of radical anti-imperialist social democracy as we move further on the road to socialism. So partly touching on some of the issues Jeremy also raised. A response to Devon from Mazibuko. Did you see that in the chat, Devon? Yes. Janet would like to respond. Let me just check that we there's sort of a bit of an exchange there, including on the study groups. I am just aware of a time, and I haven't told Janet, but I have to leave at 10 to 5 to pick up my child from
No
school.
problem.
So
No problem.
I will let you carry on if it's carrying on. But in the meantime, I thought let's take this whole round of comments and questions and give you all a chance to respond. Maybe start with Janet and then go over to Sid, and then Mazibuko and Devon again.
Thanks, Ariana. So let me respond to two things. The one is about the study groups. Alison, I think it's a really interesting topic, and I haven't read anybody who's written anything about it. So I'm thinking, I know of study groups in the 70s, and then in the 80s, you know, those of us involved with movements at the university and so on were able to have study groups. They were not banned. And I'm just thinking of I'm thinking this question of what did people read? Of what literature, what Marxist literature or socialist examples did we look at and so on? And those who were involved with ANC or SACP or Unity Movement or other study groups, what did they read? I mean, did we read different things? So I know, like at university, I was exposed to Gramsci, Althusser, Luckett, you know, all those thinkers, and they were very influential on me. In the Wages Com, we had a reading group on Rick Turner, The Eye of a Needle. Interesting, hey? It was very, very influential. In the women's movement, we read Sheila Rowbotham and other feminist thinkers from that era. I remember in the ANC, we were reading about Nicaragua. We were very excited after 1979 Sandinista revolution about Nicaragua. And then somehow the influence of the Green Book and the ANC's trip to Vietnam came through, and we were told, no, stop reading about Nicaragua. What you must read about is Vietnam. So suddenly the content changed in terms of what we were meant to read. The party, I mean, I think that there was quite a limited focus on Lenin and so on, but I would really like to get some verification of this. And this is why, to me, Matthew Goniwe's reading group is interesting, because they were explicitly non-sectarian and they read very widely in terms of the actual text that they read. And in terms of Robbie Fanike's question, I haven't thought out an answer. I mean, we've had some kind of left dialogues which have tried to do this at Wits, which have been very interesting. But I'm not convinced of a labor movement on a minimum program or a social democratic movement such, because politically it seems to be I won't say futile, but it's almost isolationist, that it's separate from the mainstream, which is still the ANC and COSATU in terms of the ANC's program and the labor movement. So I'm not sure what would be the ability, whether it would even be possible to construct a labor movement or social democratic movement beyond that, or inclusive of the ANC, the SACP, and COSATU as the alliance. And I mean, I know most people here are working within one or other of those three broad structures, like either the social movements, either the labor movement or social movements, or the ANC in some way or another. So the real independent left has to engage with those institutions, organizations, to be effective. I don't really see an independent left movement as having a huge impact. But anyway, that's my own current thinking, but I think it's really an important debate. Thanks. I'll leave it for the moment. Yeah, Devin.
Sid, over to you. Please unmute.
I was just
If there's anything
really,
you'd like to pick up on or respond to, please go ahead.
yeah, there are a couple of things, two things really, just responding to Janet. And there were definitely study groups that Neville Alexander organized in Cape Town for a wide range of activists. And that was mostly around history and African history, actually. And then in the churches, social action groups we used Paulo Freire a lot. And that's linked, of course, to the liberation theology. But just a thing to Jeremy, you know, what I think we could learn from Rojava more directly is this whole issue of municipalities. We have a structure in place, but we treat municipalities or municipal collectives as state. Just look at what's happened now with the ANC. For example, it's so depressing that the ANC is running around looking for partners to govern a municipality. In other words, it's a statist solution to municipalities. Why can't the ANC just step back and say, well, okay, that's not our main concern. Our main concern is really to build up a certain kind of ethos within the municipal collective, and there's lots of space to do that. And that is why I think, and where we can learn, because in the Rojava, it took them 15, 20 years. They were operating in Syria. It wasn't this war situation as such, but it was a kind of an insurgent situation. There were student protests and the students were violently beaten up by the police, or the Syrian police. But in the northern part, they just continued with building up local community. And that was the PKK. ANC could do exactly the same in South Africa. That's it.
Can I say something on that?
Okay, Devin, and then over to Mazibuko.
No, I think that's an excellent point, Sid, and I immediately think of the Abashlali in Durban, how they tried to organize for themselves, and the fierce hostility they get from the ANC. Violent hostility. So hoping that the ANC, yes, Matthew Goniwe ANC, yes, but the ANC of today, doing this sort of empowerment is very much wishful thinking. I mean, there may be one or two branches of the ANC that still hold these values, the values that Janet talked about. And I'd like to hear more if there are more examples, but I am exceptionally skeptical. It's correct that the ANC is out of power. The correct lesson to learn is exactly what you are saying. Let's be out of power. Let us connect with communities. Let us rebuild democratic communities. That's the lesson to be learned, but that's not the lesson that they are learning. It's all about getting back to power and to eat again.
Yeah.
Thanks, Devin. Mazibuko, would you like to come in now?
I agree with the thrust of Devin and Sid about local power, the local state, from the perspective of deepening democracy and finding alternatives from below. I think that's crucial for not just from an ANC prism, but also from the perspective of building popular power and finding a real solution to real problems that ordinary people face. And of course, what it means for systemic transformative solutions in the long term. I think it's going to require so much more than we have. We just simply do not have the critical mass required to build that kind of momentum, those elements of socialism, if you may, that need to emerge. In the chat group, I referred Devan in his response to what Comrade Mbazakele in collaboration with Janet and others have begun to do, for example, around renewable energy. That's an example of local action, of local solutions. But we need to massify that on a significant scale, and yet we do not have the partnership for that. Also in the chat, on a separate matter altogether, I was just trying to think about study group for today. What would be the kind of questions to animate study group, but also wider activist debate, and for my own personal interest around the post-apartheid social formation, post-apartheid capitalism, the current balance of forces, and what those mean for a left program. So I do not know if that's happening anywhere, and I'm very keen to see if there are comrades who would be interested to continue that in a structured way. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Jeremy's hand is up, but I'm assuming it's the old hand. I don't know if there are any final comments or questions from the rest of the participants. I don't see anybody else.
Ariana?
Yes, Janet?
I think because I'm a host, I can't raise my hand.
Oh, okay.
I've been disempowered.
Please go ahead.
Can I just respond to a couple of things? The one is the issue about the relationship to the municipality and working with and beyond the state. So just, I mean, Patrick Brennan, if you're still online, you could give some input into this, but we've had a really interesting experience because the GapTap cooperative is set up on a public open land, which is municipal land, but it's de facto managed by the residents of that particular GapTap. So, I mean, we went through the councillor and the municipality and we put in an application to them in terms of this project, etc. And they never really agreed to it. I mean, they never gave us a formal permission to use that space, but we couldn't wait for them. So we went ahead and put up something which could be considered a temporary structure. It's not like a big building or something like that. But we're working in a de facto way with the municipal electricity department, who are assisting us in a very practical way in connecting to the grid and trying to work out a contract by which we can get paid. Now it's come back to the issue about which earth it is and whether we can get permission for that particular earth. Anyway, it's quite complicated, but the thing is that we haven't been having much joy from a very public official level with the municipality, but in practice, we found a way to work with them, which is, it's quite interesting. I mean, we're just doing it as an experiment and we'll see how it turns out. I just wanted to say to Jeremy, on your point about the gap between the university space and the SACP, yeah, definitely we must try and take this forward. I mean, I do think that we've got more space in South Africa than we use. So, you know, we can talk about socialism, about communism, about alternatives. We can try and experiment with them. There's nothing stopping us from doing this. You know, we don't have to be hesitant about it. And I think academics are trying to be respectable and, you know, they don't want to say the word socialism and this kind of thing. So I don't think we need to be so namby-pamby about it. Yeah, I think Patrick's hand is up, so he can maybe respond further.
Please go ahead, Patrick.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. So the experience with Emancipatory was interesting in the sense that all the political parties agreed with what we were trying to do. So different mayors from different political parties all gave the go-ahead. There was no one against it. Similarly, everyone we spoke to in the private sector about the project were very enthusiastic and that kind of thing. It ran into problems where we had to do things like get bank accounts and interact with kind of local sort of, I want to call them sort of the business incubation support kind of networks who didn't really know how to deal with a cooperative from the township that wasn't sort of in some way linked to an outside, or linked to us, but it wasn't the sort of typical startup that they would have to deal with. And so their ability to actually interface with both the banking sector and these entrepreneurial hub type organizations, they don't know how to deal with it. There needs to be some kind of new way of, not new way, but we need a way of mobilizing those kind of support facilities, networks, resources that are available in more kind of in a way that reaches more people and not just a sort of small number of people, where it's just we're selecting people to join the elite. So we've tested out the kind of the environment, and it's not impossible. But if it wasn't the university kind of pushing the door, for example, we would never have got bank accounts. And if it was the university pushing the door with the city council, we wouldn't really have got the electricity department to kind of bend the rules so we could connect the grid, that kind of thing. And still haven't managed to get people to pay for the. We generated a bunch of electricity that's worth something, and it's been sold. It's been pumped into the grid, so somebody bought it, but we haven't been paid for it. The cooperative hasn't yet been paid for it, and that was those kind of things. That's about the linkages with the existing system, and there needs to be some kind of decision that brings a little bit of political will into the situation. And related to that, the structures that are there are fantastic. The ward committees and all that kind of thing, but nobody's thinking about how to actually use those structures in a way that takes them in this direction. So maybe not nobody, but people need. There's a lack of political will to make them work properly. And so what it tends to happen, and this has happened especially under the Subabani administration here, where people ended up in 20 people got assassinated in a fight over waste management contracts, which were supposed to go to township enterprises. That's the kind of thing that we used to see in the apartheid regime, where people were played off against each other. It's ridiculous that it's happening now under our situation. I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Patrick. I'm taking over the rest of the session. I think we've pretty much come to an end. I don't see any new hands. I just had one quick point about previous examples in South Africa of what we call organs of people's power. The one thing I noted from them was that there were hardly any examples of economic or productive organs of people's power. So they tended to be, in some cases they provided some services, limited services like rubbish collection or sort of assistance with education and so on, but actually not productive. And we know that from Kate Phillips' work, the union cooperatives, NUM cooperatives have really struggled to set up cooperatives. The Communist Party itself had a program to encourage setting up cooperatives, which had very limited success, from our comrade Mkoji Keka, who told us about it. So I think that's the next frontier, is to see if we can do that. thanks. Robbie's given a reference to Elaine Unterhalter's paper. Patrick, did you want to come back? I don't know if your hand is up, a new hand, or if it's an old hand.
I think I don't know how to take it down. I'll try again.
All right, so I think I'm going to draw the session to a close. We're 10 to 5, and it's been a long session, but thank you very much to the presenters, to Sid and Devin and Mazibuko, and and also thanks to my previous panel. Patrick and Jeremy are still here. Can't see who else is still here, but I think it's really been an interesting session. It's been a little bit back and forward from the history to the present and to different parts of the world and back again, but some great inspiration, some really great examples of what can be done, and ways in which we can strive forward to socialism, as the title of the seminar was. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. There is, I think, one more seminar or webinar in the series. I'm not sure of the date, but please won't you go onto the SAHO website, SA History Online, and check the details of the last seminar in the series. And I think we've done justice to the topic of the SACP and lineages of socialism. Devin?
Janet, you mentioned in your email publication. Do we talk about that here or through email?
Yeah, I said at the end of the previous seminar that I think we are going to have some joint discussion of the hosts of these webinars from the different universities and with Omar Bocha about whether we're going to produce some publication. And I'm not sure what form that will take. So we might have a series or post them on their website, or have a special edition of a journal or something like that. But I think we'll consult with all of the presenters about that. But I would like to see some kind of publication come out of it, and at least to make the presentations and the papers available to people. Great. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Janet. Thanks very much.
Thanks for your participation.
Yeah, thanks very much. Great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye then.